In high school and college, I would always make it a point every year to go on a retreat. This is long before I was in seminary or a priest, where as priests and we're required by canon law to make a retreat every year. But in high school, I wanted to take time, and in college, to get away and be with the Lord, take some time of silence and to kind of discern where I was headed in that direction for that year and what the Lord wanted from me, just to renew my faith. I think it's something that every Catholic should practice, an annual retreat, whatever your state in life is, widowed, married, single. There are many retreats we offer here in the Archdiocese of Denver, and we do well to take a weekend at least off every year just to be with the Lord and renew our faith commitment. And on one occasion in college, I went on a retreat, and it was a mostly silent retreat, and it was intense. They took away our cell phones, our watches. We had no sense of time. It was kind of a militaristic style, and they would just tell us what we do from moment to moment. They didn't want us to worry about internet or phones or even the time itself, and so they had to wake us up. And so every morning our alarm would be someone opening the door to our bedroom and shouting, "Christ our King!" And we're supposed to respond, "Thy kingdom come!" Get up and get ready and start the day. And it would be usually very, very early, especially for college students. And the first morning, they'll come and shout, "Christ our King," and we're, half asleep, and they get a response like that, more or less, mumbling, trying to speak and respond, politely and engaged. But as the days went on, we got more comfortable with each other, and people would come that we knew, and they would shout, "Christ our King," and we'd say, "Tell him to come back in an hour," right? We'd come up with different responses, or the very, very eager college student that was really kind of rigid but pious and meant well and far too eager to wake us up at 5:30 in the morning would come in the room and shout, "Christ our King," right? And we were ready for him. So when he said that, we responded, "We have no king but Caesar." And, he was scandalized, like horrified, like walked off so uncomfortable, and we just laughed. We're kidding, thy kingdom come, we're up. We had a different response for different people. I have a little fun in the mornings as we got more comfortable with one another. But it was to emphasize this idea that we rise with Christ the King. He rules, he reigns, and we will live and wake and sleep and die for him and him alone. It was a very intentional practice. Christ our King, thy kingdom come. And as Catholic Christians, as we hear the scriptures today, and in the context of our culture and our environment, so often our lives are deeply impacted by people who reign, right? Deeply impacted, oftentimes negatively. Like, who is the president can just fill our mind and heart with so much anger and frustration or disappointment or scandal or joy or happiness, whatever it might be. Who the president is or who the governor is can be hours and hours of conversation for months or years on end, positive or negative. Who the Pope is, right, is a big deal, and people get super happy or frustrated or concerned or scared or worse. Who the bishop is or the cardinal is can be a source of great scandal or joy, frustration and anger, or happiness and hope and relief. We have only to look at the McCarrick report to see how if we allow leaders in the church or civil leaders to profoundly impact who we are and how we live, we can be pretty angry and miserable for a really long time. And that's not even including the last 7 months. We see the shortcomings of our leaders in the church and in society, and it could be a cause of great consternation, if not just bitterness and anger. And it's interesting that as Catholic Christians, we recognize Christ as our King, but we're oftentimes too impacted by who leads us temporally. Remember, Christ established his church on Peter the rock. He was the first pope. He was the vicar of Christ on earth. And yet, he was a sinner. And he was not silent about it, nor did he keep it secret. In Mark's gospel, we hear Peter's preaching. Peter preached. Mark was his secretary. He would take notes. He would write letters for him, and he would write down what Peter would say. And then later, he wrote the Gospel of Mark. But when you read Mark, you hear Peter preaching. And far more than any of the other Gospels, Luke, Matthew, John, Mark shows Peter and the other apostles with all of their flaws. He doesn't try to make them look better. You see them fighting over who's more important after Jesus tells them he's about to be killed. Right? You see them arguing over or who should be first or who should sit at his right. And Peter, time and again, sticks his foot in his mouth, right? Getting violent when they try to arrest Jesus. Peter, put away your sword, right? Swearing at the Last Supper that he would never deny the Lord, that he would die for him. And then later that night, 3 times he would deny the Lord and then abandon him at his hour of need. Peter was a sinner, and he was the Pope, the first one. Jesus chose him. You can't say, well, the College of Cardinals messed up. Well, Jesus didn't mess up. Right? He chose Peter, knowing he was a sinner with all of his flaws and failings. And it's interesting to note that even with him denying Jesus so vulgarly as he did in the Gospels, cursing as he did so, the other 11, or apart from Judas, the other apostles didn't leave the faith. Not one of them said, look at this Pope, what a disgrace. John could have said, I alone was next to Jesus. I should be in charge. I should be the Pope. No other apostles here at the foot of the cross but me. They had every reason to be angry and bitter and disappointed and scandalized by their Pope, by their leader. But not one of them left the faith. In fact, all of them served the Lord and proclaimed the gospel till death but John, who lived to a ripe old age. They knew Peter was a flawed human being, and they followed Jesus, not Peter, though Peter was the head. And when Peter spoke, Christ spoke for the church. But the apostles knew at the end of the day, it's not about the Pope or the president or the bishop or the cardinal. It's about Christ the King. And they would not allow the flaws and failings of their leaders to hold them back from being who they were: followers of Christ, proclaimers of the gospel, missionary disciples in the world. They would not allow them to hold them back. And we're called to recognize the same as we celebrate this end of the liturgical year as Christ the King, to recognize that regardless of who our president is or who our bishop is or who the Pope is, that cannot and will not change who I am. And who are we? Well, either sheep or goats. The gospel today tells us clearly how the sheep, the loyal subjects of Christ the King, live. But why use sheep and goats? Well, because sheep were very low maintenance, self-giving animals, and goats were very high maintenance, selfish animals. In that goats, when they ate grass, they'd eat it and tear it up from the root so it couldn't grow back for other animals to graze later. When they drank in the stream, they would put their whole filthy, gross body in the water and drink from it so that all the other goats got to taste that downstream who drank afterwards, right? They were high maintenance because when it got cold, they didn't have the wool to stay warm, and you had to bring them inside and then bring them outside again. And they would just destroy everything they were around and eat anything and everything, right? That's why they use the example of the goats, selfish, high-maintenance animals. Whereas the sheep, you didn't have to bring indoors. They had their own wool. They could stay warm even in the frigid cold outside. And when they ate grass, they only ate the top so that it would grow back. And other animals could graze later, if not themselves. And when they drank in the stream, they would sit on the edge and put their mouth in the water only and drink so that the water stayed clean, relatively clean for the other animals drinking in it. They were by nature selfless, self-giving animals. They could shave their wool and make warm clothes or blankets out of it, and they'd grow it back. Hence the analogy of the sheep and goats, low maintenance, selfless animals. Right? So what are we? How will we live? As loyal subjects of Christ the King, the gospel is very clear what that looks like. When I was a college student and now as a seminary professor, sometimes then and myself, we would give the students the questions to the test beforehand. Now, granted, they were essay questions, not multiple choice. That would be too easy. But we would give them 10 essay questions and tell them 5 of them are going to be on the test. So it made it really easy if you did the work. You knew the questions. There were not going to be any surprises. You only had to do the research to find the answer, create an outline, memorize it, and then expound on it in the test. Easy. If you did the work, if you prepared, it was an A. If you didn't, it would be foolish, and you're guaranteed to fail, even though there's no surprises on the test. In the same way, we hear in the gospel today what Jesus will ask you and I on the day of our death. He's giving us right now the questions to our test. Did you feed the hungry? Did you give water to the thirsty? Did you welcome the stranger? Did you clothe the naked, care for the sick, or the imprisoned? He's going to ask you and I that when we die. We already know that for a fact. And so now it is up to us to prepare our answer by how we live now, to do precisely that with the time God has given us, regardless of who's pope or president, because Christ is our king. And as his loyal subjects, we feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit the imprisoned and the sick and care for them and give water to the thirsty and welcome the stranger among us. That's what characterizes the faithful sheep of the Good Shepherd, the loyal subjects of Christ the King. That must mark how we live, regardless of who's president, who's pope, or who's bishop. As we end this liturgical year, day in and day out, when we wake up, the angels and saints among us and in heaven cry out, Christ our King. The question is, what will be our response that day? Will we say, we have no king but Caesar, I hate the president, I'm angry with the other one, or with this one, or the pope, I'm bitter and angry, lashing out at everyone? Christ our King, tell him to come back later. I don't have time to help other people. I got to take care of me and me alone. I look out for me. Every morning when we wake up, the angels, the saints, and the faithful around us cry out as the sun rises, Christ our King. The question is, what will be your response? The loyal subjects of Christ the King, the sheep of the Good Shepherd, cry out in their action every day, Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.